Recording. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This is Grant Cameron, and I'm having a discussion today with my assistant, Nicole Sakic, and we're going to talk about some of the latest developments in the UFO field. And I've got, at the very end, I'm going to give you something that's very much new, which I was very impressed with. It's a text message I got. But good afternoon, Nicole. Nikki, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Grant.
Beautiful.
Nice to be here today.
Good. And you had the weekend off, so you're all ready for the interview here?
Oh yeah, I'm ready.
So what do you want to start talking about? Like, we got a number of subjects I gave you that we should be talking about, but let's start off with what you want to hear about.
Well, I want to hear about your last 10 to 12 days, horseback riding adventures, off to Falcon Lake.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting week. We were joined here in Manitoba by a film crew out of London, Ontario, and Toronto. And this is Rob Freeman and Mark McNabb, who are documentary film guys who have a very elaborate camera setup. They have 9 cameras that they set up, and these are infrared and zoom and everything you can possibly think of. 2 different setups, 5 cameras on one, 4 on the other. And they came to Manitoba to do some sky watching stuff because they're sort of tied in with COVID. They can't leave the country, but you can move around Canada freely. So they were here, and they brought the big camera set up. So there was a lot of sky watching. And Rob wants to. He had a sighting when he was about 12 years old, very dramatic sighting of like 100 UFOs going one way and then going back, him and his friend. And so he's always wanted to revisit, and has the finances where he can set up these camera setups, and was doing some filming here. Unfortunately, they didn't really get anything on the Skywatch part of the thing, but we did some investigations because we went back to where I had started in Carman, Manitoba. That's the first time I've been back in many decades. So the film crew went there, and I described 4 of the main sightings I had. We went to the actual locations where I'd had these sightings, because I got close about 5 times in 1975 to the 75, 76. So that's what you're going to see. They're doing a documentary. It should be out early in 2021. There's a trailer, a teaser that's going to be coming out in the next couple of days, where you're going to see sort of what they were working on. So we did the Carman thing, and we talked to Bob Deemert, who was the main guy in Carman, Manitoba, where they had UFOs for about 1.5 years, constantly, almost every night. And the UFO became known as Charlie Red Star. So we went to Bob Deemert, who had run the airport in Carman, and he did an interview outside. Because of the COVID thing, we were outside doing the interview, outside his hangars. And he talked there, and his daughter was there. We talked to his daughter. And there was a couple other guys around that I had never met before who sat there quietly and listened to the whole interview that we did. And then the one guy, whose name is Woody, I found out he had had sightings. He had moved to a different part of Canada, had just come back, retired in Carman. And he said, "Oh, I saw that thing too." And I said, "You did?" And he said, "Oh yeah." I said, "How many times did you see it?" He said, "Oh, I don't know, 24 times." And I go, "Oh, come on, let's get on the camera." He said, "No, you got enough stuff. I don't want to go on the camera." But there was a couple other people there who had had sightings and described the sightings that I'd never recorded. And that was the problem that I had in 75, is that I went and I did the investigation. But there were so many people and everybody was hiding. Nobody really wanted to talk about what they were seeing. So a lot of people sort of fell through the cracks. So we got him a little bit on camera, and I'm going to transcribe that in the Bob interview. And I put out the book called Charlie Red Star. So we're putting out a second book, because what happened in the first go-round was that the publishing company who published the book wanted 40,000 words removed. The book was way too long. So we took out 1/3 of the book. And so what we're going to do is republish the unpublished chapters, which actually goes into the fact that the sightings actually went down into Minnesota and Wisconsin. And it was going on the same time as it was going on here. And that really didn't get any media coverage either. So we're going to put that out. And so we did that whole thing. And then we did probably the most interesting investigation. Even though the Carman thing, this is the first time I've ever been on tape, actually at the site, where I'm describing what's going on, and you see exactly where all this stuff happened. and I tell these stories. They're in the book, but you can actually see me on
Mm-hmm.
camera where this actually takes place. So that was never made public. So that's going to be sort of a public story they're putting in there. And the other one was the 1967 Falcon Lake case, which we're calling the Roswell story of Canada. It was a major sighting that occurred in May of 1967. A guy by the name of Stephen Michalak is out prospecting, and he's in an area which is the Canadian Shield. He's looking for quartz and silver. He's prospecting, and he's sitting there having lunch, and this UFO lands. There's two UFOs, almost like the if you see the story of the Close Encounters of the Third Kind. There's two UFOs. They're sitting above him. He hears all the noise of the going around, and he figures what's going on here. And one of them lands, and the other one takes off, and it lands on this big, huge outcropping of the Canadian Shield, where there's no trees growing, and it lands there. And so he sort of watches it for a while, and then decides, he hears some voices, and he decides he's going to go over to this craft and find out what's going on. He thought it was the Americans, and the door opens on this craft, and so he's looking, and he's yelling in different languages. He's a Polish guy, so he's speaking Polish and Ukrainian and Russian and English and stuff, trying to get these guys to respond. And he actually looks inside the craft, and he sees the width of the walls in there, and the lights in the craft and stuff like that. Doesn't see any beings or whatever. And then the door suddenly shuts on this thing, slides, and then there's no seams or rivets. It just completely shuts off. And the thing sort of lifts off the ground, and he has his hand on the craft, and he has a rubber glove on. The glove melts, and as this thing turns, there's this vent on the side of the craft that comes around, starts his shirt on fire, and he becomes very, very ill. This thing takes off, and he has to make this trek back to Falcon Lake, Manitoba, which is a long, we went in there by horseback, which took us 40 minutes by horse. So it took him a long time to come back. He ends up in the hospital in Winnipeg. And then the story is that he's in the hospital, and immediately the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the U.S. Air Force was in there, the Army was in there, and they start doing these trackings over top of the site where he had said this thing had occurred. So it appeared that the government officials, mostly from the United States, were quite aware of what had happened because of his injuries and because of these reports, and had gone in to do whatever investigation they did at the site. They took him back a little while later, and he, with some officials, and he sort of describes it. And then what happens is he has these burns that the burns go away, and it's like a grid mark on his chest. And this grid mark goes on, and then a couple of years later, it comes back again. He's at the Mayo Clinic, and tremendous amount of evidence at the site of what happened there. So the crew actually wanted to do this, so we went in there by horseback. And we went in with the tour guide, and apparently, according to the guy who owns the ranch that has the horses that take you in there, figures there's less than 1,000 people who have ever been to the site because it's so remote to go in there. So you're going to see this on the documentary, and I spent some time with them there. We talked to one witness who had actually seen the craft as it came over Falcon Lake that day. He was a young child, about 14, 15 years old at the time we interviewed him. And so we toured around, did these different investigations, and then we did a lot of sky watching, and nothing showed up on the cameras, but you're going to see this documentary detailing these bizarre sightings. The other one we went to was a place called Woodridge, Manitoba, and it has the spook lights. These stories about the spook lights that sit at the end of the road, and I'd always heard about this. I've never gone out there. It's maybe 60 miles from where I live, and because I had seen what we were looking at in 76 was these ground lights. So I said, hey, I've seen this before. I'm not interested in this stuff. You can film this stuff till the cows come home, and it's the light on the film. But they wanted to go in there, so we went in there the first night, and it happens on this railway track. And the story is that the guy gets killed on the railway, and he's walking around with a light or whatever. There's all these stories about why the light is there. So we went there.
There is a spook light tale that takes place on railroad tracks here in my hometown. Yep.
Have you seen it?
I have not seen the spook lights myself, but it is kind of the same story. There's been a few people that have died along these tracks.
Yeah.
And they just so happen to kind of crisscross through country roads, this stretch of tracks. So if you're driving around, you actually cross the same set of tracks like 2 to 4 to 6 times. And yeah, kids like to drive between these sections along the tracks.
Okay.
And whether they scare themselves or they actually follow these lights, that's what you kind of hear, that they think it's a train, but it's not a train. And yeah, very spooky.
Yeah, so we were there, and we were taking some orb photographs, which I was taking some videos, which are kind of weird. And so we sort of got Rob Freeman interested in this orb thing, and he always likes to be checking out to make sure that it's legitimate, whatever. So he wasn't fully bought in on the orb stuff, but they were going to buy some point and shoot cameras, which is what people here were using. Most people use the cell phone cameras for to pick up their orb stuff. And so he had one, and he was joined with by Wendy Gallant, who is, if you've gone to my YouTube channel, Wendy Gallant and Rob Freeman do the blindfold thing. So I've traced all the people who teach this blindfold thing, where you can see through blindfolds and see colors and stuff like that. So she was there, and he set up the cameras like right near the track, maybe 6 feet from the track or whatever. And so then all of a sudden we said, oh, the train's coming. And so then they got it all set up. We were on one side of the track, and the cameras are on the other side of the track with Rob. And as the train came through, we were really close. We were like a couple of feet from this train as it went through at about 60 miles an hour. And the Canadian National Railways that runs the train reported us. So they reported us to the police, and because apparently there's been some accidents, because COVID, people committing suicide and stuff like that. So they were very concerned that and there was a lot of us, there was about 5 people. So we were very, very close to the tracks. And they, of course, I guess they were petrified as to what the hell's going on in this track. So they phoned the police, and the federal police force came out. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police came out. So they sent an officer out. My car was parked down the road, because this road, you can only go in with sort of a big truck or like a sort of a big vehicle. So my car was at the end of the road. So they see my car, and then they come in. And then it's like, put your ID on the hood of the car, because they don't want to touch the ID and stuff because of COVID. And what are you doing here? And then we said, oh, we're filming this spook light thing. And he goes, oh. And as we got going, this is an Aboriginal police officer with the force, and his kids were really interested in UFOs. So he starts asking questions, and then we talk to him. And next thing you know, we're sharing stories. The one thing he wanted to ask me about was with the Aboriginals, that they have a story about shadow people, and they wear the top hat. So he said to me, well, what's this about? Well, the Aboriginals are all reporting you should go to the reserves, because we have quite a few reserves here. And he said you should go to the reserves. They've got all sorts of stories, but they're mostly about this shadow figure. And I said, well, that's often reported with shadow figures. I remember talking to Chris Bledsoe about seeing the shadow figures moving around his house. And I said to him, well, did you see the one with the hat on? And Chris said, oh yeah, I saw that one. So you always have these stories about a shadow figure moving around with a hat. And that always comes down to the thing where I start to believe this is much more than extraterrestrial, because if you're a ghost or a shadow figure, like, what do you need a hat for? This doesn't make any sense. So he would sit there, he was talking to us, and he was getting stories, we were giving him stories, and then he got a call from the detachment, sort of asking him where he was, and he just radios back into the receiver, 30 more minutes. And then, so he talks another 30 minutes, and then of course they radio, because he's out by himself, and they're wondering, like, where is he? Why is he not back? He's on this report. And then they call him back and say, what's your location? What are you doing? And he just radios back in 30 more minutes, and he closes it. And there was 15 more minutes. And so we went on for about an hour and a half, and he actually got all our websites, my YouTube stuff. He got our one of the cell phone numbers so he could keep track. And here's this guy went back to investigate all this sort of stuff. So it was, even though we didn't see the light, they saw something the next night, which they did photograph. But again, it's, what that's going to turn out to be. It'll be on the camera, and, everybody's going to come out to debunk it. But they had 9 different cameras shooting this. So the second night they did pick up some sort of light that was there, and they thought it might have been the police officer coming back with his kids the next night or whatever. But so we did all this kind of weird stuff. We're moving around the province of Manitoba, filming all this sort of stuff. But we haven't had really any UFO sightings here for many, many years, even though Carman, when we were at Carman, Bob Deemer reported that he had 2 UFO sightings in the last month, and he hadn't had one for 30 years. Whereas in 1975, I put in the book that he had 150 sightings. When we interviewed him the other day, he said that was actually kind of a fib. It was way more than 150 sightings. So he has the 150 sightings, and then they go away, and yeah, he didn't see anything till the last month. So that's basically what we were doing here, and so I was sort of out of touch with what's been going on. Like you sent me the interview with John Greenwald and Valet and stuff, and there's been some disclosure stuff. So maybe if you want to talk about that, we can go into that.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask you if you finally got a chance to watch both of those. I really liked John talking about what he's encountered as far as documents being destroyed, and I wanted your thoughts on that as well, because you know it's happened to you. It's happening right now.
Yeah, that's so John is sort of I think he's kind of in a dilemma, because he actually broke this sort of the story that the Navy had declared that this thing was, you know, this is for real, these were their videos or whatever, and then he files the appeal, and the appeal comes back and basically indicates that if there was documents that were destroyed, and the appeal was refused or whatever. And so we're in this situation, and I'm going to be republishing a book called UFOs, Area 51 and Government Informants. This is a book that I originally was called UFOs, Area 51 and the Government in 1990. And that's where I came up with this idea that this gradual disclosure thing is going on. So you have parts of the government that are leaking it, parts are pulling it. It's sort of like you throw the carrot out, people grab at it, and then they pull it back. And it's this back and forth thing. And so you have a situation where, and sometimes John is saying, okay, they're telling the truth. Here's their statement. And then the next thing, it's like, oh no, they're not telling the truth. And that's the dilemma you get into with the government, is that they're telling two different stories. They'll deny it, they'll confirm it. And that's where I say this is this gradual disclosure thing, that if they wanted to disclose, they would stand up and tell you what's going on, that they're doing this gradual thing. Or you have different departments that are sort of, one puts it out and then the other one says, we don't want this out there, so then they deny it, and they're playing these little games. And I know with my own experience that when Bill Clinton was still in office in 2000, I heard that Bruce McAbee had gotten 550 pages, and there was a dentist who was filing FOIAs out of the state of Maine who had got 250 pages, including a lot of the original Rockefeller documents, like not photocopies, the originals. And he sent them back, and then Bruce McAbee told me he got 500 pages, and I filed an FOIA with the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is the office of the science advisor to the President of the United States. And that's where the UFO stuff was being held in the executive office. And I got back 1,000 pages. And then I realized that they gave me a whole list of documents that were in there. And then I compared the documents to the list that they had provided me, the index, and there was a bunch of documents missing. So I filed an appeal, and I even got more documents. So it was way over 1,000 pages, and these have become known as the Rockefeller Initiative documents. They talk about Lawrence Rockefeller going to the science advisor for President Clinton, and this interaction back and forth between the science advisor. And this is where you get the Roswell reports coming out in the 1990s. So in this whole back and forth that these documents detail, the science advisor is trying to get rid of Rockefeller, and Rockefeller's threatening to put an ad in every major newspaper in the United States. And they say, well, what can we do for you? You know, if you say this is as widely covered up as you say it is, and if it's as classified as you say it is, we're not going to be able to declassify all this. Give us one case that we can declassify. We'll go after that one case, and then we'll go after the rest of it. Will we give us something small to go after? So he said, okay, I want the Roswell case investigated. And that is why in 1993 they put out the report to do a reinvestigation of the Roswell crash. It was not because the U.S. Air Force didn't have anything to do or they wanted to get back into UFOs. It was because this was green-lighted by the White House. They were supposed to go out and do this. And then they released a preliminary report in 1995. Bill Clinton sees it. Bill Clinton goes to a Christmas tree signing in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And it's at that point he said, well, if they did recover bodies, they didn't tell me about it and I want to know. And that's why there's a second Roswell report in 1997 that basically says, oh, Mr. President, here's the answer to your question. The bodies were dummies that were dropped in 1953, and people got confused about the dates and stuff like that. So you have this exchange back and forth about Rockefeller pushing and trying to get answers, and the science advisor writing back and forth. And then what happens is when Clinton left office, it's 5 years until the president presidential files are released by the library. So each president builds their own library, and after 5 years, the president is using the documents, and then they are released by the Freedom of Information Act. And the way it works is first come, first serve. So when Bill Clinton's library opened and the documents became available for Freedom of Information Act request, I filed about, I don't know, dozens and dozens of FOIAs for all sorts of stuff. It became sort of national news because everyone's wondering why all the FOIAs coming out of the Clinton White House had to do with UFOs. And that was because I was at the front of the line. And one of the requests I made was for the Rockefeller Initiative documents. So I said, there's these 1,000 pages of Rockefeller Initiative documents. And the Clinton library came back and said, well, we don't have them. And I said, well, you got to have them because I've got the documents. I've got the index. I've got all the documents. And they went and they said, nope, they're not in our library. Maybe they're at the National Archives. So I went and I filed with the National Archives and FOIA, and they said, no, we don't have the documents either. So I filed an appeal with the National Archives and said, this is garbage. Here's the index. I sent them the actual index, the FOIA number, everything. And they basically came back and said, sorry, we don't have the documents. And that's where it ended. So unless you want to go to court, and John brings this up in his thing, so when they shut you down on an appeal, unless you got a lot of money and you're going to take the government to court and fight them in court, it's the end of the appeal. And I do have one appeal, which we'll go into, I'll talk about it in this re-release of UFOs, Area 51 and Government Informants. And that is in 1987, I believe it was 87 or 88. Bill Moore, who was behind the whole MJ-12 document thing in the 1980s, was almost like Tom DeLonge, had 24 different sources that were given to him by different government people. He was talking to all these people, getting all this material. He was filing FOIAs and stuff like that. He files for his own FBI file. And so he files the thing, and so does Stan Friedman file. And they actually opened an investigation on Stan Friedman, why he was filing for his FOIA file. But the Bill Moore one comes back with only about 6 pages of the entire file released, and that was all mostly blacked out as well. And I think it was 55 pages of documents from Bill Moore's personal FBI file were withheld B1 exemption, which is national security, and secret. So secret, B1 exemption, national security. So he filed an appeal and he lost the appeal. And so those documents, I always knew Bill Moore had that, and I had the original FOIA that he'd gotten. So a couple of years back, I filed for what's called a mandatory review process. So I said, okay, it's been like 30 years since this was released and the appeal was lost, and it's 30 years, so now this stuff can be declassified because it's past 25-year exemption. So I filed an appeal, and they played these little games. So the FBI comes back and says, you weren't specific enough on your thing. Your case is denied. And I had actually sent them the front page of the FOIA, so it had FBI, the FBI FOIA number and stuff. So I said, okay, and then all you got left is an appeal. So I filed an appeal with the FBI, and I sent them the entire FOIA. Now that's on appeal, and that's been over a year, maybe a year and a half since I filed that appeal on that FOIA. So I'm waiting to see whether they're going to release any of the Bill Moore, which will be a very significant thing, because everybody says, well, Bill Moore is just, a hoaxer and he was making these documents or whatever. But if you got 55 pages national security file on him, it indicates that there was some government involvement, and they're going to want to try to cover up what was the role of the government in giving material to Bill Moore, dealing with Bill Moore, or what was Bill Moore doing with the government. So you get these appeal processes, and that's the problem with the government documents is, and they can do this all the time. So what you do is you just destroy the documents, and then when the appeal comes, you just say the documents are destroyed, and then you have to go to court to prove that they did them at the wrong time, or they shouldn't have destroyed the documents. It's too late then. It's all gone. So John is having this sort of battle with the government, which I've had, and everybody in the FOIA business has had, where it's sort of like a vicious circle. We go round and round. And even with myself, when you get the 1,000 pages of Rockefeller initiative documents, which I don't think John Greenwald has on his site, but you get the 1,000 pages of material. Even when you've got the material and you file an FOIA on the material you already got, they say, no, it doesn't exist. And what are you going to do? Unless you've got a lot of money, you're sort of stonewalled in terms of what you're going to do.
Right. And you hear that from other sources as well. I know when we've been talking about these special access programs, and people have mentioned that they've given testimony or given evidence, and then it just disappears, and they try to track their own information down later, and yep, it's been destroyed, or when it was transferred, it was lost. Like, there's a list of excuses.
Yeah. And so you have a situation now with the ATIP program where all the documents may have been destroyed. And you have a situation where the Senate Intelligence Committee has asked for this report within 6 months as to who's running the program and what are they doing and what are they filing and stuff like that, versus another department that's saying there are no documents and basically shutting the whole ATIP investigation down. So people were very optimistic about the fact that, oh, the government is disclosing, and now you're back to the same sort of thing. Like, no, now it's a cover-up again. And that's what I said in the 1990 book, which was republished, I think, 10 years ago, update, and we're going to update it again and re-release it again. And really nothing has changed since 1990. There's really nothing in the book that I did in 1990 that's really changed my opinion as to what's going on, or the stuff. I talk about Bob Lazar in there, about how the same sort of thing, where they use this sort of gradual disclosure. They sort of, talk about Lazar, with not seeing the stuff, and yet there's a lot of indication that he actually was on the base and stuff like that. And it's to create this sort of mass confusion that the story is getting out, but the actual nailing it down and getting a confirmation as to who's covering it up. Because what we were told, I mean, that was the statement of the 1950 Canadian top secret document that said this is the most highly classified subject in the United States. So it would make sense that whoever is running the program is going to do whatever they can, and they really don't care what anybody says, maybe even including the president, that this is the highest classified secret, and they're not going to release it. So when you get these leaks, and that's what I had maintained, is that if you look at the ATIP stuff, Lou Elizondo retires, and what you get is a situation where Jim Semivan's retired, Lou Elizondo's retired, and you get this thing where it's plausible deniability. Now they're out of the government, and they're talking about this sort of stuff, and you create this this thing where you get no official person actually talking about it. Or if they do, like Ron Pandolfi, he's basically saying it's a techno scam. And this is the, which I think I talk a little, there's a book I'm going to bring out, I'm going to talk a little about this techno scam. And the more I look at what Ron Pandolfi's saying, the more I sort of think that he may be onto something, because he's always maintained the same thing. He's the only operational guy inside the government that we know may have something to do with UFOs. And what he says, and he declares that it's a, there's really no technology. There's really no anti-gravity technology. All this stuff is all just bogus stuff. And so he claims that people, and he actually claims that Hal Puthoff did this, but he's saying that what these people do is they come in and they say, it's almost like we got a cure to cancer, and we've got this, and we need some money, and that they don't have anything, and that they went after billionaires. And they mentioned the guy who owned Church Chicken, which was a big money guy. They went after him. They went after Joe Firmage. They went after, I think, Charles Bombardier in Canada, who owned Bombardier here, the plane industry. And now they're going after the intelligence. So what he's saying is that all this is a way to get money out of the government. So they've run through the billionaires, and now they're getting money from the Senate Intelligence Committee. And that's important. If he's right about the fact that they don't have any technology and that they're just sort of guessing, if we get this billions of dollars, we can get this kind of stuff. So you get these people who believe that they've got it. So Hal Puthoff would believe, yeah, we're on the verge of this thing. The only thing that's stopping us from developing the technology is we don't have any money. So they're going in there and they're pitching this thing as a threat, because if there's no threat, the Senate Intelligence Committee is going to throw you out, or the Armed Services Committee. They don't care. I mean, you have to make it in their ballpark. It has to be something that they're responsible for. So you pitch this thing as a threat, and you put it out there as if we've got to do this. it's going to have technology, plus it could be a threat to the United States, and they walk away with the money. And so I've got a book that I think it was released yesterday, and this is a book called Portals and UFOs at Mount Shasta. This is the book that I actually wrote in 2017 about my experience at Mount Shasta, where I go to Mount Shasta and I get this message from this alien through just a cell phone. It comes relayed through a bunch of people that Antarel, this being, is going to be at the mountain, and he knows I'm coming to the mountain, and there's going to be this program sighting. So when I get there, I do the fasting and all this kind of stuff, and this thing flashes over my head exactly when they said it would, 9:33 at night. This thing's flashing over my head, and I'm just blown away. I go like, wow, this is pretty weird that they would pick this off to the very minute. And it deals with a group called Mission Rama, which is started in Peru, and there's a bunch of experiencers in this group, and they use antennas, and they're able to at sometimes determine not only is there going to be UFO sighting, but exactly at what time the sighting is going to take place. So when they did it for me, where it actually happened, and it was not a very sort of dramatic sighting, but it still was something very spectacular. So I said, well, I'm going to write this up, because most people don't know who Mission Rama is, and it's like you call it like a CE5 on steroids that these guys do. They use these people are getting messages and antennas and stuff. So
the Mission Rama folks, they all started when they were kind of children. Their collective, right? Their group that they work with.
Yeah, there was two.
Or they all started when they were very, very young with their initiative.
There was Sixto and Charles Paz. We're getting messages, I think, off. They're doing automatic writing, which is a big thing in the Mission Rama group. They all do this automatic writing thing, and so they had this automatic writing thing, and they got this message from this encounter where it claimed to be an alien, and they said, well, how did we know it's an alien? Prove that you're an alien. And that's when they told them to go out to the Chukka Desert on this Saturday night at 8 o'clock, and they will land, or they will appear. And they did appear, which got these brothers really excited, and they brought their friends and their parents and stuff like that. And they started these encounters, and then they started actually being taken on board. And they have these Zendra things that appear, which are like portals that Sixto Paz has been through these portals. And a number of these Mission Rama people like Ricardo Gonzalez and people like that claim that they've been through these portals. So I wrote up the story in 2017 as the story of this bizarre experience with me, where I come in contact with this group, and I didn't know about them. And I talk about these Zendras because they opened two Zendras in 2014 and 2015. They opened a Zendra, and they would take 7 people in at a time. And in both encounters, this Antarel being appears inside the Zendra. So I interview the people in the one for sure in 2014. I interviewed most of the people that were inside that Zendra, and they all told the same story about the being standing there, what he looked like, and the fact that they were all getting separate messages as to different things. And I was just blown away with the story. I go like, man, I couldn't believe this. It was portals and Zendras and stuff like that. So I write up the whole story, but I don't release the book in 2017 because there's actually two, not competing groups, but there's 2 groups. There was a group that was across the road from us. We were up on what was called the Sand Flats up on the Mount Shasta mountain, about a mile up on the mountain. And this other group on the other side of the road that they told me, don't talk to those guys, don't talk to those guys. And I said, well, I wonder what they saw. Maybe they saw this thing at 9:33 flashing or whatever. So I contacted, and that was run by Enrique Villanueva. And he sent me a video of all the stuff that was going on. And it was like we were sleeping compared to what was going on the other side. They had beings, 24 beings, tall, short ones that Marcel Vidovic saw. And I'm going, man, they got wild stories. So I said, well, I won't release the book until I go to Enrique's event. I'll go to Enrique's event, and then I'll write it up and balance it out with these 2 groups. So in last year, I go to Enrique's group, and they have an event there. I'm not involved in it, but there's an event higher up on the mountain where a bunch of people, same thing, they got this message, where to go. They go up on this thing, and they have this encounter up higher up on the mountain. So I wrote that whole story up, and I released it a couple of months back on the 2019 Shasta event. And so I was going to balance it, but then I realized that this 2017 one, that I would release it separately because it involved these portals. And I started getting in to this whole portal thing, which really interested me. And this goes to the Ron Pandolfi thing. So Ron Pandolfi is basically saying that there is no anti-gravity technology. There's none of that stuff. That's all techno scam stuff, just people trying to get money. But he kept indicating indirectly that there was portal technology, that they actually had portal technology. So I started looking at this thing with Kit Green, where Kit Green is talking to your friend Jim Peniston. And Peniston is pushing Kit Green, who used to run the life sciences at the CIA, who ran the weird desk there at the CIA. And he was the control officer for the remote viewing program, had been involved in paranormal stuff for the CIA his whole life. And that's when Jim says to him, he says, okay, what are you doing? You're looking at these experiencers, you want DNA, you want the MRIs. What the heck are you doing? I'm not playing the game like Burroughs did. I'm not going to roll over. Tell me what's going on here. And he said, well, it's got to do with propulsion. And that's when Jim says, what do you mean propulsion? That's BS. Come on, don't give me that. It's not propulsion. And he said, well, maybe I used the wrong word. And that's where Kit Green says, we are interested. How does the phenomena pop in and pop out just as quickly? And that's portals. That's the idea that they're not coming here with big giant spaceships. Everything in time and space is connected, and they're able to pop into our 3D, become a 3D physical, and then pop back into their world. And so that sort of fit. And then you remember the released video or audio of Kit Green, where he's talking to this intuitive, who Kit Green describes as being 95 to 100% accurate, and they're working under Bigelow is again, sounds like he's running it, and they have 8 people, and they're looking at experiencers at the brains patterns in the experiencers, their DNA, and all this kind of stuff. And he's talking to this intuitive. And he says to her, and I think I'm not sure, but I think they were dealing with Gary Nolan was the key focus of this target. So he says that she's 95 to 100% accurate, and she's the intuitive that's being used by the Department of Defense, this contract looking at experiencers. So to me, that's really interesting. And so he asks her, okay, if you've heard the tape, he talks to her and he says, okay, what are we looking at here? And she starts talking about the fact that there's a portal off the coast of California near Catalina Island, which is where the Nimitz took place. And there are humans and there are aliens and there's a 4th dimensional portal. And I'm going like, wow, there's something to this portal thing. So that's why I'm dealing with people around Pandolfi. I'm not really dealing with Pandolfi. And this story kept coming out, this portal thing. And in one video that Ron was very upset that I got, he actually makes a statement on a cruise ship. He's on a cruise ship with his wife and his daughter and a guy by the name of John Sillison, who went to school with Ron Pandolfi and went to university with him out of Los Angeles, California. And it's there where they say, his wife says to him, so what do you say, Footman? That's his sort of code name. What's your name? What's your take, Footman? And he says, people have always wondered what it's like to go into the next world. The next time John goes to the desert, a number of us here will go into the next world and come back again. And that's describing this rumored story that there's this portal. And then there's these stories about John Sillison having these portals, recovering an actuator off an island called St. Catherine's Island off of Georgia and from Costa Rica. And that he recovers these actuators that make the portals work. And so I looked at this portal stuff, and that's the book changed. So it was going to be originally the whole Mount Shasta thing and these Zendras. And then I started tying it into all these portal stuff. So the book mostly turned into portals. So it's going to be basically what I've heard about Zendras and portals and this whole idea that I'm looking at now. I'm just guessing that I would say if the government has anything, they may have portal technology. They may not have anything else. And if you remember the other night, you sent me the interview with Jacques Vallée. So Jacques Vallée is given this question, well, do they have a crash flying saucer? And you see how he tries to walk around the question. And he says, well, you know, whether they do or whether they don't, it's not going to help us. There's nothing we can do with all this kind of stuff. And the idea is, goes back to a story that I heard, and I have in a couple of books that I published, was a thing called a core story. That there was a core story that helped put off Kit Green and Jacques Vallée get together at Denny's restaurant in the 1980s. And they sit down and say, okay, there's a lot of weird stuff going on. There's a lot of people making up stories. What do we know for sure? And supposedly the core story they came up with was we are being visited by some sort of intelligence. Number two, we have crashed material. And number three, we aren't doing very well. And that's my sort of position. And I can't remember who we were talking to just recently. Who was it that talked about that? Oh, it was when you and I were doing the interview with Don Schmidt, who had done all these Roswell investigations. And he said the same thing. He said, I don't think they have the start button. They can't get this to work. That's the whole story, is they may have a recovered craft, they may have bodies, but they can't do anything with this because it ties into consciousness. So that's where this book more turned into sort of an update on portals. And there's some of the portal stuff I haven't put in there because this is a developing story, that there may be more coming on this portal thing, which at one point I asked one of the people that was around Pandolfi, I said, I'm getting tired of this rhymes and riddles and bird codes and all this kind of nonsense. And I said, I'm ready to drop this thing. Do you think I should drop this portal thing? Is Ron just screwing around with us or just messing with us? Or do you think I should stick around? And there's a pause, and he said, you should probably stick around. So I stuck around, and the more and more evidence came forward that there may actually be something to this portal thing, that technology, and that fits into the whole consciousness thing, that I'll read this text message that I just got ties into this, and I'll read that at the end. But that's basically these two new books. So I'm going to re-release the UFOs, Area 51 and Government Informants, which is the whole story about this gradual disclosure thing, how the Tom DeLonge thing is the same thing as the Bill Moore thing. It's no different. It's the government using this indirect plausible deniability, retired people, and or government people that once they're exposed, like General McCaslin and General McKay and Robert Weiss from Lockheed Skunk Works, when they get outed by WikiLeaks, suddenly they're gone. And everybody says, oh, they've been removed. No, they haven't been removed. They've just gone into the black. They're still probably part of Tom DeLonge's operation, but they've been exposed. So I believe that it's the same sort of thing. It's this gradual disclosure thing that's going on, and yet they're covering up at the same time.
So just to spin out this speculation a little bit, is a tech grab or a money scam based on tech. Would that mean that if it would follow some sort of pattern, like you mentioned, the church's chicken?
You're losing your audio.
Maybe TTSA go bankrupt? Is that how that would play out? Like, I know you said there's indicators, like once a project is talked about, they say it's closed, or they shuffle around the name so they can say, oh no, there was nothing there, we already shut down that program. Well, we kind of saw that with ATIP. Oh, it's closed down. Oh, it wasn't really called ATIP, it was called ASOP or ESOP or OSAP. There we go. So we see these little discrepancies with how they could do this sidestepping and backpedaling already, like the foundations for it. So that final step would be TTSA just goes under?
No, I think they still operate because they've got the TV shows, and they're just sort of the mouthpiece to get the material out. And I think they have positive intentions. So Tom DeLonge really isn't so much interested in technology. He's just interested in sort of the stories of UFOs and stuff like that. He's the Hollywood guy, or the storyteller. I think he even calls himself the storyteller. And so I believe it's almost like you've got a cure to cancer. So you've got a cure to COVID, or you've got a cure to cancer, and you really believe it. So I think they really believe that they can back engineer this stuff. Whereas when Tom talks to the head scientist at Lockheed Skunk Works, the guy says, well, what do you think? How do you think this works? And because at that point, he was working for Greer. He was working with Greer, and he was doing the CE5 stuff with Greer, and Greer always talked about consciousness. So he said, oh, I think consciousness is involved. And that's when the head scientist says, oh, now you're talking. And so it's the idea that they think, I think that help put off all these guys believe that they can build this thing, but you need the money for it. And the Lou Elizondo is the key to this whole thing. And you remember they leaked the document, and I always had contention with the leaked document. When I first heard about it, I said, well, show me the document. There's no way they're going to drop this thing. And there's going to be a problem in the document. So they sent me the document, and of course, it's Lou Elizondo's resignation letter, and it doesn't have a date on it. So I said, well, how can you resign if you don't have a date on the letter? I mean, this is crazy stuff. And plus, he's resigning to the Secretary of Defense. And it's like you work in a restaurant. You're not going to resign to the head guy in New York who owns the whole company. You're going to resign to your boss at the restaurant. It doesn't make any sense that you'd send your resignation letter to the Secretary of Defense. And there was words misspelled, like deferred retirement was misspelled. And so that was the whole idea, is Lou Elizondo is the key to this thing, is to the link between the government. So what you would get is people inside the government who want this thing out, because there's always this debate whether they're going to cover up, and some people. So Lou Elizondo, I guess, my guess would be he was about to retire, and there's even a statement where Tom DeLonge says, so you have this idea he resigned in disgust, and a couple days later he's working for Tom DeLonge. Well, there's the thing, and I've got it on tape, where Tom DeLonge says, I hired him away. And now you see this posting that Tom DeLonge did a couple of weeks ago or whatever, where I commented on it, where he says, I was brought into a group. And I said, well, finally, Tom DeLonge is telling the story the way I told it in Managing Magic in 2016, before he ever went public.
Yeah, that was our buddy Dave Scott. He started that whole conversation with us, I think.
Yeah, and that was the idea, where the story is being spun out that Tom DeLonge gathered these guys together, where in fact they brought him in. They needed him for whatever this program. So I'm just guessing, you would have people inside the government who wanted this out, and even the idea that Tom DeLonge contacted John Podesta. So he contacts John Podesta, and John says, well, give me a call in a couple of months, and Tom DeLonge figures, well, this is nonsense. He doesn't believe anything I'm talking about, so he doesn't phone him back. And then John phones him and says, I need you to come to Washington. This is very important. I want to be a part of this. So that's when the disclosures thing started. It started with Hillary and Podesta. It didn't start with Tom DeLonge and Trump. It started way before. And because Hillary didn't get elected, they had to redo the thing, and it took 9 more months to bring this thing out. So you have this situation where I think, and again, I'm just guessing, I think Lou Elizondo knows an awful lot more than what he's saying. So he always says, I've got security clearances, which I always wondered, like, if you retired, if you resign from your restaurant in disgust, are they still going to give you keys to the restaurant? Well, no, they're not going to give you it didn't make any sense to have security clearance. So he'd be sort of the inside guy that is being used. But I think they legitimately believe that they can build this thing, and you've got to get money. And that's where you have the threat thing, where, if you remember, our friend Melinda Leslie said she asked Jim Semivan, and Jim Semivan, she asked him about what could I do that would get you so upset that you would never talk to me again? And he said, mess with the money. And that's his whole idea. They want this money, and I think they honestly believe that they can back engineer a flying saucer, which is what I disagree with. I don't think they're going to be able to do it, because I think it's way more complex than what they're putting out. But it's like a cured cancer. You have to get the money somewhere. So that's where I differ. And if you get into the valet interview, so after John Greenwald, valet talks about, and he says, well, when he's asked about the crash flying saucer, he says, well, we've got this metal, and I've disputed this metal all along, because they're saying, well, we've got this metal and we're investigating this metal. And I say, this is theory of wow. This is not a piece fell off a flying saucer. It didn't come across the galaxy, and then pieces started flying off the flying saucer. So they take the metal and they say, okay, we've got this metal. If we can back engineer this metal and figure out how it works or whatever, that it's going to tell us how to fly a flying saucer. And I'm saying, no, it's not. It's just going to tell you it's really weird. And all the metal is really, really weird. And I'll give you an example. We were at this site, and a lot of people don't know this. We were at the famous 67 site in Falcon Lake. And they went in there and they were trying to find out where the radiation, but the radiation wasn't radiation. There's a dispute. Was it radiation or was it not? So it seemed to be radiation, but it was really weird. It was a weird type of radiation or whatever. So they go in there to see if there's any radioactive source inside this huge rock that this thing landed on. And they find metal. They find silver, 95% pure silver and 5% copper. But it's weird. It's got weird properties to it. So again, Rendlesham Forest had metal. This thing had metal, and they're dropping this metal. And I'm saying, it doesn't matter. You can discover this thing. It's going to have weird isotopes. It's going to have all this weird stuff. It's just weird stuff that it's almost like a quartz. It drops it. It makes you think or whatever. But the idea that if you can figure out what this metal is made out of, that suddenly you're going to figure out how the flying saucer works, I would guess that it really doesn't have anything to do with flying saucer at all. It just has to do that they're dropping this stuff and they're getting people to think about it. And that's what people don't realize. There's this metal all over the world. Desta and I had one at the University of Arizona where we were looking at James McDonald's files. And Desta actually found it just near before we were leaving. And this was a piece that was 1939 in Illinois, where...
That's what I was going to say. Illinois has a famous... It's kind of like a spiked piece.
A spike that looks like it has bubbles, like the metal has sort of bubbled on the end. And 1939, the guy reports it's flying out of the sky like a meteor, and it lands in his garden, and it's so hot you can't touch it. And a lot of people will describe this metal. When this molten metal falls, it's very, very hot. You can't touch it. And then it cools off and it solidifies, but it's molten metal when it falls. So this guy describes it as very, very hot in Illinois, 1939, and he waits, and then he uses a knife to dig this thing out of the garden. And later on, he gives it to his daughter, who lives in Tucson, and she takes it back in the 1960s to Tucson, and she doesn't know what to do with it. So they open a NASA lab when they were going to the moon in '67, and she takes it to James McDonald, and they get this thing analyzed. And it's the same thing as the metal in Falcon Lake. It's very, very weird metal. And it's 95%, 99% pure nickel. And they take an analysis that was done on, they cut off the end of the spike, and then they see it's got a core, a copper core in the middle of this thing. And again, it's like, it's very, very weird. And they did the analysis and said there's nothing in 1939 of that purity that would have fallen out of the sky. So it's not a piece of a plane or something like that. And again, it's just very, very weird, almost like the mystery, the theory of wow type stuff. And so that's what I'm saying, that, and that's some of the stuff they're asking for the money for. And that's maybe the idea that we can build some technology from this. So it's always this thing about, can we get some technology? Can we build better cell phones? And that's where they're going. But I think it's, they may learn some sort of properties that they can learn from metals. But in terms of a flying saucer, you're not going to get it, because there's so many of these stories. Chris Bledsoe tells a story where I said they were shooting it out. And he said, no, they don't shoot it out. It drips out of the UFO. And I go, well, how do you know that? And then he describes this orb that goes over his driveway, 11 feet up. It's flying across, and it's dripping this metal. And he scrapes the metal off the driveway, and he collects all this metal, and does this all the time. It's done it numerous times throughout history.